it's me and Justin, who's here as well, and Shaylin, who couldn't make today. So we operate a nonprofit called Front End Development South Africa, which kind of facilitates like events, meetups, and so forth. We originally started out as Cape Town Front End Developers Cape Town, but then kind of due to interest, we kind of grew, and because of COVID, like we obviously broadened the scope a bit because we weren't like doing in-person meetups anymore. Yeah, so like as part of that, we thought that, because we are not meeting in person anymore, we don't have the constraints of only like having in-person speakers. So we thought it might be actually a good opportunity to approach people who would not otherwise be able to kind of speak at the meetups. So first and foremost, like thanks for actually being keen on doing this. So how the Q&A generally works is I'm going to do my best to introduce you as best as I can. But then I'm going to just kind of allow you to kind of just give a bit of background to yourself, the type of things that you work on, maybe plug a couple of projects that you're working on, and maybe just share a bit in terms of your journey and so forth. And I think then we can just open the floor to any questions from actual attendees. So for the rest of you guys, you are welcome to, Justin just shared in the chat, in the text chat. You're welcome to just ask a question in the text chat. I'll just relay it to Jason. But otherwise, you can just address him directly via audio. So I'm happy to just do a quick intro, unless there's anything else from your side, Jason.
Nope.
Okay, cool. So from my side, I think I first came across Jason's work by means of Preact, which is probably what he is most well known for. I worked for a company that had a pretty big website in 2016, had a lot of JavaScript, a lot of legacy JavaScript. I think we had like 2 versions of prototype running. And so we looked at bringing in something like React. At that point, it was basically just React and AngularJS, wasn't really Vue. And so we kind of looked around a bit. We came across this thing called Preact.js, which is essentially a super lightweight version of React, weighing in at 3 kilobytes. And so I think that was kind of the first time I was introduced to any of the work that Jason does, although he tends to have lots of projects. 2 of them I actually use quite often. One is HTM, which I think is HyperScript. I'm going to mess it up.
I don't even know, actually. I'm going to look that up.
I'm going to have to Google that. But so that's pretty neat. I use that quite a bit. I actually contributed to some of the documentation myself as well. And the other one is a Workerize loader, which allows you to run web workers by means of Webpack. But so with that being said, like that definitely doesn't do justice to like just all the like pieces that you're involved in. So I'm happy to give it over to you. Have you kind of introduce yourself, give a bit of background?
Sure. So I currently work at Google. I am a DevRel on the Chrome team, or I guess on the web platform team more generally. And so part of the reason why I work at Google and the reason why I have that role is because I, for whatever reason, have decided that for much of my developer career, I was going to focus on problems that affect the whole ecosystem, typically front-end development, but at the very least, JavaScript development ecosystems. So a lot of the projects that I work on center around problems that are either difficult or impossible for any one person to address. So, the Workerize loader is one small example of that. JavaScript has access to threads via the Web Workers API, which is now available in Node. But they're really painful to use, like more painful than you would ever imagine to use. And there's very little that has been built on top of them to make that better. So that space has been sort of slowly evolving over the past couple of years, but Workerize was kind of my attempt back in the day to at least make it so that you could treat a worker like a thread, like you'd have in other languages. So that's typically where I tend to start my problem solving process. A lot of the open source work that I have done has been scratching my own itches, either solving problems that I've run into at prior day jobs, or solving problems that I've run into as part of trying to maintain the other open source projects that I have that were solving other problems, which, as you can imagine, is sort of an endless spiral of tooling to support tooling to support tooling. And so I've sort of committed myself to, whether intentionally or not, I've committed myself to kind of following that circle to see how far it goes. So another example of that was in the early days of Preact. I sort of bet the project on rollup and built up a configuration around rollup that let us write Preact's source code in a way that was relatively easy to read. I won't say easy to read, but relatively easy to read. And then compile it and minify it with some custom configurations in order to produce the absolute smallest possible, chunk of JavaScript that we could create. So we do things like all of the internal stuff in Preact is prefixed with underscores. And when we compile that, they all get compiled to single letter variable names and things like that. Not just for, local variables, but also object properties. And so eventually I had enough projects that followed that model because I was just happy with the output quality and size that I got really tired of maintaining those rollup configurations, because every project I'd basically copy and paste the old one, into a new repo, maybe change one or two things about it, change the name. And that was sort of what created Microbundle. And so now most of my projects and around 3,000 NPM modules that aren't mine can just sort of use this off-the-shelf rollup configuration. It's just a glorified rollup configuration, but the idea is all of those things that you would set up in rollup, when building an NPM module or a library, it tries to do them automatically for you. And to the extent possible, it will try and choose the right things rather than you having to go and research and figure out, like, what's the state of the art for, main fields in a package JSON? Do I need to have UMD these days? What's the field called? So it tries to do those things correctly. Obviously, like, at the center of a lot of this stuff is Preact, especially at this point. I like to refer to Preact just as a small virtual DOM implementation. Obviously, the majority of folks coming into it in the early days were seeking something that was directly compatible with React. We do still very much support that. We have an add-on module called Preact Compat that has theoretical 100% compatibility with React. But what we actually have seen in the last 2-ish years is, now that Preact, like, developers are maybe more generally aware of its existence, there's a stronger movement towards using Preact as not necessarily like something you'd alias in for React when you go to production, but rather using it in place of some other smaller UI library or framework, in order to avoid having to learn a whole new set of tools just in order to do something different. So if you built your website in React and you've got that, or your admin dashboard or whatever, and then you also want to build, a widget that you're going to put on other people's websites, it'd be sort of annoying to have to say, like, well, okay, but, the widget is actually going to be vanilla JavaScript, and we're going to, like, have this whole different model that we follow for that. Preact kind of represents a nice option there, because even without Preact Compat and that extended layer, it looks and works just like React. And so you can by and large just pretend that it's the same thing. And so the design of the two libraries is wildly different. I would imagine it's about as different as they could be while still, having the same public-facing API. But they have quite different goals, and so we have this shift now where Preact as a virtual DOM library and a renderer kind of serves two masters, and so a lot of the decision making and kind of project leadership stuff that's been happening over the last year or two is trying to figure out what is the best way to deliver on both of those goals without compromising one of them. So you've seen, we've made some changes around what belongs in Preact Core and what belongs in Preact Compat. We're a little bit more aggressive about pushing things into the Compat layer because only around 50% of projects use it. And Preact Core is now, it is and is also moving more towards being just sort of a lightweight, generally acceptable implementation of the ideas that we all like from, not just from React, but from this space. So, the hooks and state and inversion of control and scheduled updates and stuff like that. And it just tries to do those things at a reasonably low level. And we provide a plugin infrastructure that you can use to modify that behavior or build a framework on top of it, or all these sorts of things. Yeah, so that's sort of been my thing. A lot of people end up asking me, maybe I'm preempting somebody's question, but a lot of people end up asking me how or why, usually why Preact became a thing. What was it that led to that, that tipping point where I decided, oh yeah, there should be a library for this, or I guess another library for this. And so I guess the main thing I like to start off with is by saying that I've only used React, like normal React, a couple of times in my life. Usually to compare Preact's behavior to a demo somebody has sent me where, the timing's different for this and this, or the refs behave this other way. I have worked on, at arm's length, one production React app. So I'm sort of an odd person out because I actually have mostly been working on the periphery, not on that tool. But the way that React came about was actually I had been working on this gigantic platform at my previous job. It was trying to build an operating system in a browser tab, and then once we put that in place, it was building a rapid application development framework for this operating system thing inside of the browser tab. And I was basically, I got to sort of, play puppet master where I didn't have to rely on the web platform or even necessarily JavaScript features. I could just change how they worked because there was so much substrate between me and the browser. Still rendering in the browser, but that's kind of all I was using it for. And I quite liked that because this was back in, I don't even know if it was, I guess somewhere between 2010 and 2012. It was before the web components standards had really made their way into browsers, but after the specifications had been kind of shared more widely. I spent a decent chunk of time implementing the web component specifications in this crazy browser in a browser, operating system in a browser thing that I was building. And so I set up sort of like a nice little box for myself to play in, myself and my coworker at the time, who, yes, I subjected to all of this. So apologies to those people. But I had a lot of APIs at my disposal. I didn't really care about the size of things. I think we were shipping 3 megabytes of JavaScript, gzipped and minified, and that was just for the operating system piece. All the applications were then on top of that. It's obviously, not super performant, but there was so much power there. And so eventually, for a number of different reasons, I had to stop working on that platform and shift my focus to other stuff. And when I gave up all of that power and the ability to like go and change how the web components implementation worked, or change how CSS worked, change the performance characteristics, I felt kind of helpless. I was sort of dropped off on, it was like, okay, well, here's a blank HTML file. How would you develop things in this scenario? And having spent years in a scenario where I never was faced with that, right? There was just obvious choices for everything. It was paralyzing. I spent a couple of months just trying to figure out like, what does web development look like now? What do I think it should look like? And so I bounced around a little bit. I had this nasty habit of re-implementing things that already exist, either like sometimes without knowing that they exist, as a way to understand the core concepts. And so for a while, I was playing around with like nested view frameworks and MVC type stuff, built a bunch of different unnecessary replacements for Backbone. This is after Backbone was even particularly popular. I think it was sort of starting to fade away at that point. Don't know why I was working on that. And on the side, I was also thinking about game engines for some reason. I don't know why I was thinking about game engines, but that summer, essentially, it was like summer of 2014, maybe. I had this idea of like, oh, I'm going to revive this thing that I was working on years prior to that. It was a game engine built on the DOM. And so I started kind of figuring out what that would look like in vanilla JavaScript. And I think it was all mostly in a code pen. I ended up building out kind of a diffing engine for DOM. Take in a description of what you want the DOM tree to look like and walk over it and make the actual DOM tree look like that thing. Repeat. Worked on that for a little bit, and then I ended up realizing like, oh, like I could use this to build applications. This would actually be kind of nice. You just throw new descriptions of views at this, and then it didn't have the Backbone problem where you'd have to, if you have like an email inbox with a bunch of messages in it, and you redo the template for the email inbox, all the messages go away, which was kind of nice. So that was a fun realization. And at some point, somebody sort of tapped me on the shoulder virtually and said like, hey, like, I think you might be re-implementing React. And so like, I was, I guess, aware of React at that point, had never really looked at the code or even really how applications are using it. But that's the thing that made me aware of JSX. And so I started to kind of meld the two. And at that point, I kind of went and looked at React's API and thought like, oh yeah, there are a lot of similarities here. It looks like they are using this game engine model. And so I renamed a couple of things just to see like, oh, could I run some of their examples in this thing that I've built, which at the time was like 500 lines of code. And it sort of worked. So I spent a couple of months evolving that prototype into kind of a library. To be honest, it was like one of my first open source libraries of substance. And it just sort of grew from there. I think it got posted to Reddit at one point, and people started flooding in and finding all the bugs, of which there was a lot. And it kind of took off from there. And so now it's been 5 years, I guess, which is crazy to say, like 5 years old. I keep laughing. People will, sometimes I search for Preact on Twitter because I'm a masochist, and I'll see somebody saying like, oh my God, like there's so many new libraries. Like, what's this Preact? I'm thinking like, this is like a third of my adult life's worth of time. It's like, it's not new. It's old, if anything. Yeah, I guess that's sort of the journey of how that came to be. We've been through 2 full rewrites now. We are actually partway through a 3rd rewrite that hasn't been announced yet. So I guess that's what this is. So and part of that is like Preact is a super weird code base. We can't really have internal abstractions or any of these niceties that make developing things easy to follow and stand the test of time. So every once in a while, we have to kind of stop, rethink, see if there's a better strategy for something. So we're doing that again. And right now, like Preact is fast. It's one of the faster virtual DOM libraries, definitely not the fastest. Was never really the goal. But the new version, or at least the new renderer, which is the part that we've got done so far, I was pulling some stats the other day, and in the common cases, we're looking at another 50% performance improvement, which is a little bit nuts because we already rolled out a 50+% performance improvement in January of 2020 in Preact X. So I think that puts us kind of back up near the top of the charts once that rolls out, which will be interesting. It's also interesting because we weren't really intentionally trying to eke more performance out of things, or actually changing the design to make it more sane for everybody to work on. Just happened to end up having that result. So yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, that's kind of the story. Trying to think if there's anything else worth touching on.
So the specific Preact X rewrite, that was, if I remember correctly, that was in response to, sure, this is actually such a long time ago. It doesn't feel that long, but to kind of React Fiber, in which the React team kind of went back and rewrote the React from the ground up, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was partly that. React's performance improved and kind of reminded us that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. Actually, the biggest single thing that caused us to investigate and subsequently pursue the rewrite for Preact X was fragments. We had done a bunch of experiments trying to land fragments in Preact 8, and I don't think I would call any of them successful. It was just such a hard thing to solve in the model the way we had it. In Preact 8, we always diffed the DOM against the virtual DOM. And so we had to store a bunch of information on DOM elements like, hey, you were rendered by this component. Oh, but actually that component rendered a component that rendered a component that rendered you. And so then we had to have all these properties, like we used to call them higher order component stacks. And this was all just on DOM elements. And as soon as you add fragments into that, you might have a component with no DOM element that renders a fragment that renders two components, one of which renders a DOM element, one of which renders a component, and that component renders a fragment with, as 0 to n DOM. It just becomes a huge mess. You end up with essentially a unknown tree data structure on every DOM element that you're trying to diff with an unknown tree structure that's not related to those DOM elements. And yeah, so it was very, very, very difficult to graft those two models together. So X, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for us. And we created a repo. I think it was originally it was called ceviche. I have no idea. I had eaten ceviche at some point around the time when this happened, and I think I checked on npm and that name was available, and so I just made that the repo name. I did not realize at the time that it was going to end up just being this funny thing to hear. We're there's a bunch of different countries now that the Preact core team spans, and hearing everybody's pronunciation of ceviche was always hilarious. Ceviche or ceviche. Made me realize how brutally anglicized my version was, and probably horribly incorrect. But that was the biggest thing was we needed to change our data structure and diffing model so that we were diffing the virtual DOM elements that get returned by your JSX to the previous virtual DOM elements returned by your JSX. So tree to tree, and then we changed the DOM to match that. And that's actually, so we delivered that, we shipped that. That was a big piece of the performance improvement was we barely ever touch the DOM anymore. And when you do touch the DOM, you're generally crossing bindings, and that has a cost. So now that we're not crossing those bindings, we don't pay that cost. The follow on, this new renderer that we're working through now, one aspect of it is doubling down on that. So in the case of the new renderer, we don't ever even rely on the DOM tree structure at all. Right now in Preact's diff, I believe when you are reconciling lists of children, so if you have like an ordered list with keys and you reverse it or sort it or filter it or whatever, we'll use like next sibling and previous sibling to figure out like where do we need to move these elements. This is a move or an insert or a delete. And so in this new renderer, we don't do that. We use positions within the virtual DOM to figure that stuff out. And so theoretically, like it can run against a DOM that has like 4 methods defined. It just doesn't care at all. And that's been one thing. And then the other thing is we had originally intended to have Preact X include a bunch of extra features, sort of similar to the whole fibers thing. And we landed part of that. So we landed partial support for suspense, enough to provide the suspense API, provide mechanics, and have all of the common cases work well. But it is not an actual, it's not analogous to React's concurrent mode. And so that is one of the things that we're exploring now with this subsequent rewrite is, because we kind of took those things off the table last time, we're reintroducing them and seeing, how does this change the data structures? How do we have to model things differently to account for this? Which has been interesting because like Preact supports via compat the suspense API, but the Preact core team, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think most of the Preact core team, certainly myself, we have sort of a different view of suspense and the mechanics of that. In general, there is a lot of interest in the Preact core team in things like progressive hydration. And I'll explain that because I know that sounds like a buzzword. Progressive hydration is basically, if you have an application, normally you have a render call that says like, render my app into body. That's really expensive. It can take some time. If you're using Hydrate, it will take less time, but it's still like one and done. You have to wait until it's done before the browser can respond to input and all this kind of stuff. And it's also really messy if you want to like render your app, but all of your routes are code splitted and like dynamically imported. They might not be ready by the time you call render. And right now in, the sort of the status quo is you get pretty disastrous performance there. You'll see, you have a server render website, all the JavaScript finishes loading for the initial render, it calls render, and all that lovely HTML that the server generated gets destroyed and replaced with loading spinners, which is almost always not what the user would prefer. I think they prefer it to have things that were already sent to them and shown on the screen stay on the screen. And so there's a very, very strong groundswell on the core team around making sure that our primitives for suspense, this throw catch semantic that sits behind all of it, work really well for the progressive hydration case. So even, I think we landed this in 10.5 as like an officially supported mechanism. You can throw anywhere in the tree, any component can throw. And as long as you catch that error somewhere up the tree, we will preserve the tree that was sent to you from the server intact. We don't destroy it or tear it down. And the next time you go to render, we will finish hydrating that part of the tree. So you can imagine in an application with a ton of components, if you actually just intentionally, strategically throw at a couple of different points in the tree, you can break up that hydration work yourself and define exactly where those boundaries are. So we've got a bunch of examples of this where, like I think the lazy method, we have a lightweight version of that works this way. So you can have a lazy component, and as long as you server render it, it will just hydrate after your application. It won't show a spinner or anything like that. It just hydrates later. Or there's other cases where you can have a component that throws anytime rendering reaches it, unless it's in view, which basically just says like, don't render me if I'm not on the screen because I have nothing to update. You don't pay any cost for that component, which is pretty nice. So we're pretty bullish on that semantic, that idea of essentially haltable rendering. And it also happens to be the one that is most easily and effectively supported by what we landed in Preact X. So it works during hydration, initial tree creation, and rendering. So that's kind of the direction we've been going in. And then this re-architecture that we're undergoing is just exploring, like, can we even leverage that more? We're bringing some asynchrony into diffing, so we don't actually have to diff in a single pass anymore. And then obviously the performance improvements.
Yeah, like definitely I hear you in terms of the suspense API, and I think if anything, like it just feels like whether Preact or React or so forth, like this idea of dynamically loading code, I mean, this is as old as AMD, like this is what AMD initially tried to do, and like it didn't turn out that great because turns out it's really complicated to do, and it's like this thing of like, okay, code splitting isn't great, so let's look at other ways of like fixing the problem, and that's how we kind of arrived at suspense. But it's kind of almost like a hydra, now we're creating 3 more problems, like even more complex problems. So like it's interesting. I'm curious to kind of see where the JavaScript world and specifically the framework world goes in terms of this, because even with stuff like Gatsby and so forth, so for example, Gatsby started out as a pretty straightforward concept, like it was kind of very similar to like React Static and so forth. And, like, and it's just like, as they solve problems, they just created more problems for themselves. Yeah, exactly. So, I guess this is the problem of trying to write software in the browser. So like, well, whatever, like we'll see what happens there. But so I have some questions for you, specifically regarding like kind of just like maintaining open source projects, and also regarding web components. But I'm just wondering whether anyone else maybe has any questions they want to ask Jason before I get into that. I don't see anything in the text chat just yet. Is there perhaps anyone who has a specific question? Okay, doesn't seem that way. So I'm more than happy to just hog the floor. So yeah, you did mention web components, and I know this is kind of an area where Preact differs quite a bit from React. There's a lot more like crossover in terms of like web component implementations and so forth. But like, just speaking about web components in general, like I've also kind of been on this kind of web components like journey now for a while, and like it kind of almost feels like this was the next station after like ES6, so ES6 came and we had this big thing, and it was like, like it's like I almost want to say like it kind of revitalized the entire like web technologies community. And it seemed like web components is kind of the next thing. This is like going to be the next game changer. And like, obviously I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, but for me personally, it kind of feels that web components didn't necessarily pan out in the way that I was hoping it would. I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions, specifically in terms of accessibility and rendering without JavaScript. And, you just spoke about like hydration and those things. And, like there's so many problems in terms of web components that need to be solved there. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts on that, and specifically, like kind of whether you going back would have like paid more or less attention to web components in Preact.
So I have a roughly similar opinion to yours on this. Web components, there is a lot of value in those specifications. They do provide a lot of things that are hard to implement in user land, or that when implemented in user land are less effective. Like for me, the example that I always hold up is like, it used to be that we would have jQuery plugins. You would, run a selector and then call .carousel or whatever on it. And you had to, as a developer, define like, oh, when am I going to run this? When is the document done enough that I can run this? What do I have to pass to that carousel method? Even in the first place, what is it called? And what structure did the DOM have to have in order for that carousel thing to actually work? So there's a lot of guessing. And I think that the huge initial value of custom elements, at least from my perspective, was it gives you just a way to automatically attach JavaScript code to a given place in the DOM. It's a super simplified view of what it is, but like just to be able to say like, yeah, like whenever there's time and the code is downloaded, the browser, when it sees this element, is going to run this code over here, this constructor. And that's pretty valuable because there's like so many solutions that we have built in the ecosystem that ultimately come back to like running code in response to the existence of an element. And we can kind of replace most of those with custom elements. Things got a little bit trickier with Shadow DOM. And for a while, I was a little bit confused by this because in that giant weird operating system in a browser tab thing that I had been working in prior to Preact, I was working primarily in a custom elements Shadow DOM v0 environment that I'd created for myself. And I thought it was fine. I actually, if I'm honest, the developer experience there was certainly faster for me to be able to create applications. I felt like I was just sort of playing Legos a lot of the time, which I like, and I liked when I was a kid. I like it now. So like that was valuable, and it was confusing to me to see that the web ecosystem hadn't immediately jumped on that. I think maybe part of that was the transition from custom elements v0 to v1. It wasn't even that big of a transition, but just the perception of like, oh, this is a web platform API that got deprecated after a couple of years and there's a replacement for it. That's new. That's something we haven't really run into before. So that was a little odd. And even for a while, my own knowledge of custom elements and Shadow DOM and in general web components was incorrect as a result. I had learned v0 and I kept trying to apply that to the current version. Even after kind of crossing that hurdle for myself, though, I think once I had bought a little bit into this virtual DOM space and the idea of my code being the source of truth, right? My representation of the DOM tree being the authoritative representation, it started to get more difficult to reconcile that with the development pattern I had been using, where the DOM was not only the source of truth for the tree structure of my application, but it was the tree structure of my application, right? Like if I wanted to have a toolbar inside of my app, I had to append the toolbar to my app element, right? Like there was no indirection. And I waffle because sometimes now I think about like some of the problems we face with trying to add a scheduler into virtual DOM so that we can spread out the work of doing diffing. And my brain does occasionally go back and think like, what if we didn't do diffing, right? What if we could just not do that work? And that's a hard question to answer because there are lots of things about the developer experience of these tools that rely on virtual DOM or any other essentially double buffering implementation in front of the DOM that I like. I like the ability to have my own definition of lifecycle methods. Component did mount, component will unmount. Even some of the newer stuff like effects. That feels a lot more ergonomic to me than the constructor and attribute changed callback approach of custom elements. Maybe not as different as it used to. Now that use effect is essentially like a attribute changed callback. But I find that is an awkward thing. And even so, I'd recently published an article with Mason Fried introducing declarative Shadow DOM, which is sort of an emerging specification that we've shipped a preview of in Chrome. And I was really excited about that because if you make Shadow DOM declarative, it's actually starting to attack some of that difficulty of custom elements essentially requiring JavaScript. But I was worried, even when I was writing the article, that there would be a perception that that this was supposed to be the last piece of the puzzle, and in reality, it's not. There's still a lot of pieces left. So like I kind of viewed it as declarative shadow DOM was the hydration process. So it's essentially, taking the DOM tree, the light DOM tree, and hydrating it with your shadow roots, and also giving us a way to serialize them when rendering on a server. But it's still very much missing what virtual DOM gives us in the form of reprojection. So you can't define a component in HTML that has a template with logic and then say, oh yeah, all the buttons on this page use this template to render them. There's still not that concept yet. I think the closest thing we have to that is Apple's template instantiation proposal, or whatever more recent incarnation of that there is. And so in my mind, and again, like this, I'm not involved in the standards process by any real measure, but in my mind, if I sort of zoom out far enough, I can see a world where with template instantiation and declarative shadow DOM landed, and maybe this simpler CSS scoping proposal that's been going around that it's not like shadow DOM where it's like all or nothing. If you bring all those things together, it almost starts to look a little bit more like what we currently use virtual DOM for. And I don't think that like convergence is the point there, but if we're all basically saying like we're using virtual DOM in various forms in Vue, in Angular, in React, Preact, etc., because of X, Y, and Z, because of reprojection and having a different tree structure from the DOM, then if we can introduce those concepts to the DOM, it's possible that frameworks could leverage them, right? Like maybe Svelte or Vue or whatever could take their templates, and instead of compiling them to a shim that sits on top of the DOM, they could maybe even compile them directly to DOM. This is all super pie in the sky, but like that seems like an interesting place for us to eventually get to. I don't know whether we've moved past the point though of being able to say, like I think Dave Rupert's been kind of pointing this out to people. It's possible that we've created these specifications in a way that is potentially useful for compilers to output, but we might have missed making specifications that are useful for actually, writing by hand, like typing into your text editor. And I think that is an excellent, that's an excellent sort of thought experiment. Is it even possible to address both use cases, right? Virtual DOM sort of doesn't, and that's okay. We've all just learned to deal with that. Maybe the DOM has to have some other way of figuring that out that will work. But yeah, I was kind of hoping when I wrote that article though to be able to say like, oh, here's declarative shadow DOM, here's the polyfill in the example, and by the way, here's like a weird, messed up version of Preact that I've compiled that uses this, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. I should be, right? Like I was there sitting next to the spec, and also I'm pretty familiar with the Preact source code. So like, yeah. So but to me, that just means like either they're incongruous, and that's okay, or there's still pieces of the puzzle left to solve.
Yeah, I've also been following Dave Rupert's almost want to say kind of like his commentary on web components and so forth. And yeah, like I think what became clear to me from just his comments and so forth is, as you mentioned, like he very much looked at it in terms of general developer experience. So he very much wanted something that allows you to kind of import blocks of HTML in the way you would do imports in ES6 and so forth. And yeah, like and it almost feels like this whole, because at some point there was kind of this notion that
we had HTML imports.
And I think like HTML imports is kind of this microcosm of like all the tensions like that's at play here, you know. On the one hand, you want to kind of like have something that can compete with like templating languages and so forth, but at the other hand, like on the other hand, you kind of wanted to adhere to, like, I almost want to say, the legacy of what the browser is, you know, and so forth, and almost, you know, like I almost want to say like web development is also becoming more like, I almost want to say cognizant of like computer science principles, you know. So you don't just want to like slap things on like for developer experience, and that's always a tricky thing. And to me, like the kind of the imports or kind of the microcosm of that tension in terms of what is web components supposed to be. And you know, at the end of the day, from where I'm standing, it very much seems like kind of the web components as primitives kind of side one at the end of the day, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, like as you said, like for compilers and not necessarily for developer experience.
Yeah, so I guess like I'm kind of hopeful that we'll see, you know, that we'll be able to move a little bit past some of the goodwill that was burned or misplaced with web components journey through, like, oh, we're a framework. Oh, wow, actually no, like we're a framework. I realize that we are a framework for making frameworks.
Yeah.
And like if we can all kind of acknowledge, like, okay, well, where we landed is actually that, you know, we gave ourselves hooks in the DOM. And if we're honest about like that, maybe that's all we use this for, and that's okay. I wonder what a world looks like where frameworks, where like, you know, somebody like, let's say there was a Preact component based class or whatever that you could import, or a decorator or something that, you know, instead of just rendering by referencing a function that happened to be another component, it would inject a custom element boundary, and maybe that would be how it would lazily boot up and hydrate just independently of the rest of your application. I would love to live in a world where that's not Preact saying, oh, you know, we're a custom elements framework. That's just Preact using the DOM. It's the same as calling document.create element, right? It's not contentious. It's just there's an API for hooking into what elements are created. Why wouldn't we use that? That feels like a safe, small step in the direction of, you know, maybe a little bit more interoperability between frameworks, and a little bit more just making better use of the primitives that are there. They shipped, they work well, and kind of trying to remove a little bit of the like you're either web components or you're not duality that we have, because I don't see it as being super necessary at this point. You can pick and choose. You can use custom elements without a shadow DOM, and that's just fine. That's, in my opinion, that's ideal. But
yeah, but I almost think like web components has kind of been, the problem is that it has been hyped so much. And for me personally, like it kind of came straight after, as I mentioned, like this ES6 like afterglow of like, hey, like the web that we've always wanted is arriving. And I think in retrospect, for me, you know, like just thinking like ES6 was actually, or well, ES6 and kind of the whole ES Harmony, all of that was kind of not that hard of a problem to solve, because you're already working on something that's programmatic. A lot of the behavior you can just do by means of syntactic sugar, you know, like classes and so forth. Whereas HTML is a completely different beast in its own, you know, like it's kind of, not only is it declarative, but it's kind of, if you bring in the DOM as well, it's kind of like this weird space between declarative and programmatic, you know, like it's like this, yeah, it's just like the DOM is such a weird thing, actually. You know, I think it was different if we created our websites programmatically by writing create element, append element, append child and whatever. But yeah, it's just, I think like the HTML and the DOM already is weird. And, you know, by like pulling in web components, like we're just adding to the weirdness. But that
I'm kind of surprised that we didn't transition to an era where there was an expectation that you know, UI toolkits and those sorts of things were delivered as HTML elements, because that's the one case nowadays where, you know, if you survey the lay of the land for, you know, material design toolkits or whatever, I might be weird with this, but like I would much rather just use one that's just looks like an HTML element. Just give me a replacement for select that looks good. Give me an app dash bar element. I don't need it to be a framework specific component. I actually don't get much value out of that. But but
sure.
again, we have that duality where like, oh well, now you're using custom elements. I kind of wish that it was just like it's just one of the ways that you might choose to do that thing.
No, sure. But that being said, like I think maybe as a segue back to Preact is, so you start seeing things like Stencil.js and so forth. Like, what is how do you feel about like Stencil's a good example, but there's also like lit HTML and those type of things. How do you kind of feel Preact stands in relation to those?
We kind of ride the fence. So Preact doesn't leverage web components APIs, but it specifically is designed to try and not prevent their use. So we want to be able to use Preact to render the internals of custom elements, and we want to be able to use Preact to render custom elements. And the idea is sort of going back to what I was saying about custom elements already being probably the better way to build UI kits and leaf nodes. The more of that stuff that we can take out of the virtual DOM, right, and out of this semi-expensive double buffering model, the better. And so I think most of the folks who use Preact and most of the folks on the Preact core team are kind of cognizant of that. I think it's interesting to contrast things like Preact and Lit because their goals are maybe somewhat similar. It is like be small, provide good DX, and deliver like high value per byte. And so it's interesting to see like they end up being sort of a similar size. They end up having kind of similar characteristics. And I always wonder like, what does Preact give up by not doubling down on custom elements, and what does Lit give up by requiring itself to use custom elements? Because it's not the same people working on those projects. It's impossible to ever have like a perfect understanding of those trade-offs. I do think there's value in that though. Like I think it would be not great if we had UI bench and all these benchmarks that were like hyper focused on wall time rendering performance, and they were only benchmarking virtual DOM implementations, because you'd have something like Lit or even like Solid come in and completely decimate all of them. But if we're not actually making those comparisons because that's a different type of thing, that would be doing ourselves a disservice, right? Like I think it's important to factor in, even if you're stuck in a model, what not being stuck in that model would look like for performance, for DX, for outcomes, just so that you have a benchmark, right? Like, with this new renderer that we're working on React, we very much want to make sure that we don't spend half a year on this, ship it, and it's just perpetuating a model that has fatal problems. So we're trying to sort of go a little bit further than just comparing this to other virtual DOM frameworks, so that we, if we're shipping something in 2021 that uses virtual DOM, it will be because there's benefit. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worthwhile.
Yeah, no, definitely. One thing that I can though say, and this is maybe kind of like more to my uncertainty around like web components and so forth, is one thing that I do feel that Preact, specifically Preact CLI, gives that I don't get from Lit, is kind of being able to output static HTML from the same code base. And I've played around with Lit a bit. Like I think there's one called, I can't remember what it's called. It's like Lit NHL or something that allows you to run it through Node, but it has so many caveats in terms of, and so I'm kind of a very big supporter of kind of like the kind of a Jamstack approach. So to me, that definitely has an appeal. Maybe it's not that big of an issue for everyone else. Like if you're maybe creating like your templating with PHP or whatever, and then just kind of hydrating it, that might be fine. But for me, this is definitely, so I do hear you about like, like what are you sacrificing by adhering to this, or to the flip side? And I think
like the ideal for me is that at the very least the renderers, right, these lowest level primitives, but even the things that sit on top of them, the sort of frameworky bits, I would like to try and move in a direction where the difference between that, PHP with stuff grafted into it on the front end and Jamstack style single page application but pre-rendered, as a developer, maybe you wouldn't need to necessarily decide up front, or it wouldn't be a rewrite if you moved from one to the other or back and forth, or you could reuse components between those two things. That's actually, that's the other big thing that the Preact core team is working on right now. We're done our build tool that we're sitting on waiting to release. I had originally intended to release it back in August. We found a bunch more stuff to work on. One of the things that we added between August and now was automatic pre-rendering, just static HTML, and it's significantly better than what's in Preact CLI. So if Jamstack with pre-rendering is your thing, now we're doing asynchronous pre-rendering and automatic data hydration, and you don't need to provide a list of URLs. It actually implements sort of a little search engine thing and crawls them for you. There's huge value in that, but I also I want to make sure that we don't over-index on that Jamstack server, like static site generation model. So what we are finding is ways to use these primitives, right? That suspense style throw and catch, the way that we're doing pre-rendering that accounts for that, and the boot up on the client, which has an interesting novel thing that we haven't introduced yet. And all those mechanics, and even actually the APIs you use to enable them, they're the same, whether you're doing pre-rendering, static site generation, server-side rendering, or none of the above. We can actually use the same mechanism to hold back switching from one route to another route on the client that we do to do stateful server-side rendering. And it's no code change, it's the same semantic client and server. And so like there's in almost all the cases here, all the work to make this stuff actually happen is done. We're just in the position now of trying to figure out like, what do we tell people like to explain what this is, right? Like what is all this stuff? What do you call these things so that they're intuitive to use? Without just, we don't want to just like say, oh, we have React suspense API, but it works in this different way. We'd like to provide something a lot higher level and more meaningful than that. Like I've been experimenting with a hook that essentially makes render promisable. That's a terrible way of explaining it, but like you can ingest data during rendering and it will account for that. It will suspend if possible, otherwise it will give you loading indicators and stuff. And you just don't have to think about that as a developer. You can just pretend your data source is synchronous. So providing things like that to kind of meld all this stuff into one. Because ideally, like I think what we'd like to do is ship this command line tool that we've finished and have that be like, if you're doing static site generation or building a widget or whatever, this is what we think that you should use for Preact, and then ship a corresponding tool, which we already have 3 different implementations of and need to pick for full server-side rendering. So if you're building a shopping website or a search engine or whatever, like, Jamstack might not be for you. Here's as close as we can get while doing headful rendering in Node. Because right now, like we provide Preact CLI, but that's very over-indexed on the static case. I think we'd like to provide good solutions for both. And simpler, to be honest. Preact CLI is Webpack based, and there's a lot of internals that ask anybody on the CLI team, they'll tell you they're difficult to maintain. The new tool is not Webpack based. It's actually technically in development not even rollup based, but it does support rollup plugins.
Yeah. No, it's like I do hear you, and it's that problem of like you also don't want to like, so like in terms of, so generally if I do a project that's super complex, I generally go for something like Gatsby or Next.js. But then for the more lightweight like things, I tend to, it tends to be just kind of between 11t and Preact. But so one thing that I think 11t has done, I don't know how I feel about this, but I think I'm coming around to the concept that they just said that, like, we're just going to give you the basics, like all this Webpack, hydration, all of this tough stuff, like we're just giving you like templating and there you go. So there's also, like, but then like, that being said, I get frustrated with 11t, like,
Right.
which is why I then I'm just like, I'm just going to use Preact. So I think like that's also kind of like a interesting tension, like you have a basic tool, but you don't want to build it out so much that like it's essentially the same learning curve as React.
Right.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So like ideally, I would just like to remove the technical barriers in that whole decision-making process so that, if you're using 11t and you want to make a really dynamic component, or like one page has a thing on it that's dynamic, there should be a way to use Preact with 11t that's just as nice and just as optimized as if you built the whole site in it. And ideally that would be where we would use a custom element to automatically boot it up, and it would do, there would be an 11t plugin that would render it, on the server during build time. I really I want to have no barrier there.
Cool. So we're nearing about an hour. I just quickly want to check if there's any questions anyone has apart from myself. Cool. Doesn't seem that way. So I maybe just in closing, I specifically like have a question regarding, because I maintain some open source projects as well. And obviously even like this front-end development South Africa stuff, obviously it's not near to the operational overhead that you have something like managing the Preact team. But, like some days I'm just like, I should be very careful of what I'm saying now, but sometimes I'm just like, I'm over this. Like, I'm gonna delete my GitHub profile. I'm just gonna focus on my career. Just like put in a 9 to 5. Leave all of you people complaining about outstanding issues and features that you want. Like, just leave me alone. How do you manage that? Because I can imagine, like, not only with Preact specifically, but you have a lot of projects, a lot of open source projects. Do you ever kind of get burnt out by that?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've had like multiple years of my career in like recent memory where I have essentially not worked on open source. Or, the more common thing for me is like, there's one or two projects where what I get back from the time I put in is above a threshold, and those are the only ones I can bring myself to work on. And so anybody who's submitted a PR to one of the repos that isn't in that list that I maintain, they know firsthand that there are lots of PRs that I have that I'm getting pinged on that are 2 years old. I merged actually three of them today in a repo that I forgot I owned. Like I do get asked a lot, like, how do you maintain all these projects? And the sad answer is I don't. A lot of the times, like it's the same with a lot of open source. Like I'll create a project, I put it out there, and if I'm using it, I'll continue to drive it regardless of whether anybody else is using it. If I'm not using it and I'm not able to find someone else to help maintain it, sometimes they do get stale, and that's just life. So yeah, I mean that's the easy answer. The hard answer is I put in a lot of extra time, and I shouldn't, and I've been trying not to, and that's why maybe more of my repos at this point are in that other state. That's also honestly one of the reasons though why we've been looking at some of the things I mentioned around bringing a little bit more focus in Preact on the how, or like that really front of mind developer experience facing stuff is. I do think that I personally have spent a decent chunk of time on things that I may have solved better if I backed up a little bit and put more planning effort in rather than just attacking the problem head on. So we're trying organizationally, at least inside the Preact team, to do that, and I hope to also apply some of that same rigor to my personal repos.
Yeah, so that's something I'm kind of grappling with personally, but I think like also as a member of kind of the development community as well, I think kind of the whole everything that happened with MDN recently, kind of opened my eyes a bit, like in terms of just like how we take open source for granted.
For granted, yeah.
And yeah, no, for sure. And like, like, and even as someone who maintains several things, I myself like do that. And I think like, so recently, not recently, the beginning of the year, the ESLint team actually kind of started a fundraising drive, and that turned out to be like really like work out really well. So I'm hoping we see more of that type of thing going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely been through that with Preact. There's been lots of points where myself and the other core team members have kind of been like, oh, like I wish we had more people. Like I wish we could grow our team. And obviously, our problem is there's only a certain pool of people who are just interested in working on low-level virtual DOM stuff. And we're not the only library that needs those people. But at the same time, then you look over the fence at I don't want to name names to single folks out, but like some of the projects that are the most widely dependent on infrastructure in the JavaScript ecosystem are smaller teams than Preact, which is unfathomable to think about. And I think a lot of it just comes down to there's some people who are putting in heroic levels of time and effort, or who are hyper productive and smart. And I don't think there's a way for us to ever compensate those people in a way that is anywhere proportionate to the time and willpower that they have put into those projects. So it's kind of staggering. It's a little bit scary. But on the other hand, it's amazing that people are willing to do that. That's great.
Yeah. No, and it's tricky as well. So like about a month ago, like I did a lot of work on, during like COVID. So by law, our government was kind of required to publish all the expenses and procurement and so forth of items like tenders during COVID. But, in classic governmental fashion, like half of the things are Word documents, other things are like just some weird CSV thing. And we've been systematically trying to kind of make that machine readable so you can actually search through it and find patterns and so forth. But the problem is like, so we've kind of played around with maybe you should just pay people to help out. But the problem is once you start bringing money in, people start thinking about it in terms of kind of the hourly rate. And then they kind of realize, like, I'm doing this for next to nothing. Whereas, like for myself as well, I think when you're doing it freely, you don't necessarily make that connection. But yeah, it's a tough problem to solve.
Yeah, we have both sides of this where it's like we have funding. Like Preact has quite a lot of funding actually, and we've had both the problem where like. How do you equate how much money to give somebody to compensate them? Because like you sort of want to think of it as a gift, but then that's totally backwards because they put in so much time, right? It's, if anything, they're just a horribly underpaid employee.
Yeah, it just highlights that.
Yeah, but then at the same time, we also have had lots of cases where people don't want to take money because for them, like it's almost just like philanthropy, right? Like they believe in what we're doing. And it's almost like taking the funding can sometimes make that feel less empowering. I've certainly been in that situation myself where it's like, I don't know whether I would be okay being paid to work on Preact because I kind of work on Preact because it's enjoyable to have something to work on in my free time, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I guess it's also that fear of losing like a sense of agency.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool, Jason. Thanks so much for your time. I think we're about hitting the 1 hour mark now. This has been super insightful for me. I've been following you quite a while on Twitter and also like just in general on, I really much enjoy the name of your blog, which is JSON format. Yeah.
Needs a rewrite, honestly. It's like a ancient version of Ghost that is probably going to get shut down from Heroku for being on like Ubuntu 12 or something.
Well, I guess time to go Preact.
Yes, I've been thinking about it. We've got all this framework that we've been writing, right? Like, I need a website.
Eating the dog food. Cool. But yeah, thanks so much for your time. This has been a great experience. And hopefully we can bring you on another time again.
Yeah, anytime. Maybe in person in South Africa. I'm due to come back in a couple of years. We were there 2 years ago and loved it. So.
Oh, okay. So, well, maybe when you release that new rewrite, you know,
yeah.
and then maybe we can set something up. Yeah.
2021.
Cool. Take care.
Alrighty.